Welcome to This is Getting Old, moving towards an age-friendly world. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and in today's episode, we're picking up with part 2 of our conversation about aging and how words matter with Dr. Patricia D'Antonio. If you missed part 1, you can find it on whatever platform you use to find this episode. Dr. Patricia D'Antonio is the project director for the Reframing Aging Initiative, and the goal of this initiative is to help media and the public reframe some of the ways that we may think and talk about aging. In part 1, we talked about what the Reframing Initiative is and why it's important. And now we're going to pick up this conversation and discuss how we should be talking about aging and the impact of implicit bias in aging.
We're going to now talk about move into kind of how to tell the story of aging. I know when I was telling you this when we talked prior to the podcast, when I first started the podcast, I would be talking about a healthy older adult, kind of that ideal person on a cruise ship. And the image, the video that would be inserted had to do with someone in a wheelchair in a nursing home. And after the third or fourth time that happened, I was like, it was fascinating to me. I was like, this is a podcast dedicated to, eradicating ageism. But what's happening with this, you keep putting ageist videos in here. And so, I've always reviewed all of my podcasts because I was like, that can't be there. And so, that's just one small example of, trying to change the narrative. So how should we be telling the story of aging?
So I think the one thing that we need to do is, and we teach this pretty intensely with people, is how to look at messaging and think about that better way to incorporate those values that we talk about, right? So sometimes we tend to we lead with the demographics, right? So that could make people think in a crisis manner or fatalistic manner. So sometimes, start a little bit about your story, and the demographics maybe can go paragraph 3, right? Even when you're speaking in front of audiences or you're writing for an audience that may not be as familiar with aging as we are in our everyday work, we don't always have to lead with the demographic because that makes people feel like we're going off a cliff. Another piece to think about is, and I talk about this all the time, is when I write or when I speak, I watch how I use us and we versus using them and they. Because again, getting back to what we talked a little bit earlier, othering people, any group of people, othering that group of people really does, and it's hard, right? It's hard. See, I just slipped right there. Really does start to create that dichotomy that we're trying to get beyond when we think about aging, so that we recognize that we're all aging. I think the other piece that's really important here is that when we talk about aging, we should recognize the dichotomy, or we should recognize the diversity in aging, right? So when you think about somebody age 60 and over, if we were in a large room and I said, everybody, well, think about somebody who's age 72. I'm pretty sure if we had a room of 100 people, we would have different pictures of what a 72-year-old person might look like, right? So some of us have multiple chronic conditions, and we might have a more frail condition right now. Some of us may be the person that can run the marathon, and may be the person that at 90, we could think about a 90-year-old who's still working. It's important that we recognize that breadth and difference in all of us as we age. Whereas if I said to you, think about 5-year-olds, it's a little bit more a same kind of picture that people get. And we have to remember that as we age, there is that difference, that diversity. And so we shouldn't have that one picture of either everybody on the cruise or everybody in a nursing facility, right? So that's really important there too.
Well, and part of that has to do with, in childhood, you have developmental milestones that you have to meet, and we typically meet them all within a certain time frame, or you're identified as having a developmental delay. Well, we don't have that for aging. Your trajectory could be as different as night and day. And I've done past podcasts talking about the difference in, my grandmother's, but I think that your association with a 72-year-old probably first goes to anybody that that's 72. And if you know a healthy 72-year-old, that might be the mental model that you have. Otherwise, it probably shifts to this more negative kind of cueing. So when we're telling stories about aging, like, why does it matter and how does it work and kind of what can we do about it?
So I think it sort of so we kind of circle back to where we started about why does it matter. I think when we can get people to talk about it, we can get people to talk about aging. We can start to change the discourse, what people are thinking about it. And as we start to do that, ultimately, our goal with this project is to be able to get policies that support us as we age. So if we can get that discussion going, and if we can get people to start to think about aging differently, right, more productively, and I don't want to say positively in the sense that it's not, we do recognize that some people are frail as they age, right? So it's not all of them. And that's the important part, is to recognize the difference, right? Recognize the diversity. Scientifically, we always use the word heterogeneity, right? But think about it in that perspective. I'm often talking when you think about how we report age cohorts, often we talk in 10-year increments until we get to the age 65. And then we say 65 and older. And that can be a 40-year span when you think
plus.
About how, right, the 85 plus population is the fastest growing population that we have. And so the important thing to think about is define the age group that you're speaking of. If you're presenting and you really mean people age 65 to 75, that's how you should describe it for people. It helps them think differently. The other thing that we found in our research is that some words that are used for older people could contribute to that frail thought all the time. So the word seniors, we tend to recommend, now I can't be the word police and I'm not going to be out there for every time someone speaks. So, but what we learned in the research is when you use the word seniors, it cues an incompetence in people's minds, and it cues that frailty in people's minds all the time. So you're not thinking about that broader 40-year age span that I was talking about. The same thing happens when we say the elderly, right? So that's othering, right? So the elderly. There are cultures that use the word elders, and that's fantastic, and that should be used, right? You have to know where you are and who your audience is. I don't advocate that every organization take the word seniors out of their title just to be able to get someplace around reframing aging, because really the important part is how are you talking about that, right? So what's your communication strategy? Because you could not use the word seniors and your communication strategy could be fatalistic and crisis oriented, and so you're not getting anywhere. The other thing that we talk about is around using the terms older adults and older people. So I'm going to ask you a question. When people age 18 to 25 were asked to guess or think about, how old is an older adult? What do you think they said?
Probably anybody over 30 or 40.
Right. So usually it was 40 to mid 50s. So What that tells us is if we use the term older adult in audiences, people aren't going to get to the age that we're really trying to cue to get people to think about when we tell our stories. So the word, the concept of older people, when we asked the same question, the research showed us that people got more to the age of 60 plus. And that's what we're trying to cue when we're writing or speaking about aging. in this scenario. So that's how we got to older people. Or what I recommend usually is if someone's writing or speaking about older adults, 75 and older, like state the age in the sentence, because then it helps clarify that cue for people about what you mean. But you're right, like an 18-year-old, older adult is, their parents' age. So that, could be like 40 years old, right? So we really have to think about that because it matters. The words matter that we use.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what you were talking about with the language, and going back to what we were talking about in the beginning, how we think about aging ourselves actually impacts how quickly we recover from disease and maybe an accident. And if we have self-imposed ageist beliefs, it can actually shorten our lifespan by 7 years. And so it's important for, for experts to communicate with the public and for the media to communicate with the public to make sure that the thinking for Americans is positive about aging, because it can shorten your lifespan, and you can end up with more health problems because of it. And so, to me, that's really a huge role for the Reframing Aging initiative. But then also, like we've said a couple of times, to then move into this systems approach to help people age well, compared to putting it on the individual and making it all their responsibility. So in addition to those kind of wins that you've had, talk about some of the ways you are trying to help the media and academics and emerging scholars kind of understand how words matter and why their language is important.
So that's the $1 million question there, right? So we have been working to teach people the communication strategy much more specifically. So I talked about the 10 aging organizations that collectively are known as the leaders of aging organizations. Each of those organizations has adopted principles through their communications. One thing that we worked on, we do realize that how the research is published is how clinicians and the media pick up that language. And I talked about modeling language earlier, right? So they model we all model what we hear. So, or what we read. So we worked on getting style guides changed for publications. So the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and even the Associated Press have updated their style manuals to adopt language around aging that is more in line with what we see in the research. So instead of using the word seniors and elderly, refer to older people or be specific about the age group. And that has a really big impact when you think about how universities, publications, associations, when they publish, use those style manuals. And in talking with colleagues at the American Psychological Association, high schools and even some middle schools now, as students are writing their papers, are using the APA style manual. So this really starts to impact, across our life course in how people start to think about aging. That also impacts how the media will publish. Now, we have time. It's going to take some time to get this changed, but when the Associated Press adopts a specific model in their style guide, that's what editors and copy editors are going to look to as they're reviewing the stories that are published. So that's really important because we're trying to change communication across all media. The other thing that we've done is, so we have national work that we do to disseminate this research, to make sure that people understand what it means. And we're also working with different areas of the country, different organizations across the country who has said, I want to do this in my community. I want this to happen in our area. So Changing the Narrative in Colorado has been doing some fantastic work around workplace initiatives. And I mentioned earlier about birthday cards. So around changing the narrative around aging. There are colleagues in New Hampshire and colleagues in in Connecticut and Massachusetts. We have funding through Tufts Health Plan Foundation. There are colleagues in San Antonio that are working through their organization to influence policies in the city around aging, and also to influence the community at large. And then we've also been doing some work with an aging organization in New York City, Live On New York, and they really have been rallying everybody this year around the elections in New York, and questions to candidates are really focused on, what are your policies that will benefit us all as we age, and framing them in that way to recognize that, these policy changes can affect us all and benefit us all. So we believe that with that spread locally, the work nationally, we really will be able to impact and change culture around how people think about aging.
Okay, so I think the last thing we're going to talk about before we connect people to resources is kind of how implicit bias plays into the aging space. And so maybe first let's explain, kind of quickly define what implicit bias is, and then for people that maybe aren't familiar with it, and then explain that to us as well.
Sure. So let's go back to early on. I talked about a definition of ageism, right? That's discrimination of any person of any age, a certain age group. And we're talking about older adults today, right? So it's that tendency to regard older people as debilitating. Well, we have some subconscious thoughts about that, right? It starts when we're very young about how we are taking in information about aging and older people, right? And so it becomes those thoughts and those feelings that you have that you don't even realize that you have those implicit biases. We have implicit bias about many things, right? But it's really that internalized bias that we have that it's subconscious. We don't even think about it. But it's tied to how we have to process so much information, how we have models that we think of, and those, how we become aware of things and how we process everything really quickly, right? We can't stop and rethink and relearn something every time it comes before us. So really that implicit bias based on age starts young, and it can be harmful and challenging for all of us, right, to think about that. Some of the things that we work on around that, when we help people develop well-framed messages, and we have some research that's shown where we ask people, what do they think about aging? They give us their answer, and it's more around those negative models that we talked about, right? The us versus them, the fatalism, the individualism. We read them our researchers read them a well-framed 2 sentences about aging. And, a couple minutes later said, so tell me, what do you think about aging? And you should hear and see the difference in how people, the same people, how they respond about that is just amazing. And what we've seen in the research, and we have evidence that shows that making people aware of their implicit bias usually starts the road for decrease. You can get somebody to decrease that bias because of it. So making people aware of their implicit bias to ageism, to aging, will get them to start to think differently about aging.
Yeah, I was reading something yesterday, and it said, not all is lost, because ageism actually is a malleable thing. It's probably one of the easiest ones that we can do. And what you're describing is when you first ask someone about what does aging mean to you, and they present the negative, kind of you get arthritis, you get sick, you get all the negative things, and then you give them 2 sentences that present a positive. It's a story about a positive aging, and then when you go back and ask them, their answers are positive. And so I don't know how quickly you could do that, but with racism or sexism, make that kind of distinction. Maybe you could, but that to me, I think, is probably the most optimistic news, is that it is something that we can shift very quickly just by getting the stories right and presenting aging in a positive way. compared to, the birthday cards, which I just had to go buy one the other day, and I did not buy an ageist one, but I was like, they're still here. Yeah.
Well, I think that so you raise a really good point there. And I think that's the important thing. All is not lost, right? And that we can improve people's thoughts about aging by cueing those values. I talked a little bit earlier, and in our training, we go into much more depth about that, that older people are part of in a just society, right? And that we can, our concepts of ingenuity, our value of ingenuity, we can, solve problems. And those pieces, when we talk in metaphors that explain that, it really does get people to change their implicit bias. And that's the first step, right? And so that's the key to get us going.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it really is. That's the first step in fixing ageism is to raise awareness. So the Reframing Aging Institute did this research. They have these findings, and we've mentioned the training a couple of times. So let's talk about, if someone wanted to learn more or they wanted to go through the training. I still want to go through the training. I've listened to all the webinars, but I'm like, I just want to go through like the whole course and send maybe some people from my production team. Although they have gotten a lot better. So like now I very rarely, it's usually if they switch to somebody that's new. So it is possible to very quickly be like, this is the word that we use. Here are my standards. And I talked to you about this. I was like, I need like just a little guide that they can give, to anybody coming in that's going to work, because I was like, it'd be terrible to have like Towards an Age-Friendly World podcast and have ageist show ageism show up in there. So what are some additional resources, and how could we connect to the training?
So the first thing, we have a website, and it's reframingaging.org. If you go there, we have a couple tools that you can get started very quickly, right? So I have it here. We have a document that explains what reframing aging is, what the initiative is about, and on the back is a quick start guide, right? So we talked a little bit about some words and cues that might not be as productive, right? So the tidal wave and tsunami, and then we say, we'll try affirmatively about changing demographics when you talk about as Americans live longer and healthier lives, right? So we have some suggestions that you can start just as a quick start guide. We also have some videos there that you can review. And we have, for those who might be interested in the research that led us here, we have documents up there to read about the research that got us to the solutions that we offer. We do have the ability to come to different different organizations and make presentations. Part of training people locally is that we have people around the country that are available to do that kind of training. I think the last thing that I would point out is that there are also some resources where we have highlighted what people have done to be able to reframe aging. We have a newsletter called Caravan that we publish every other month, and sign up for that. You can sign up very easily right on the website, and so you can hear what's happening around the country. You can see what we have called out sometimes when there's something quite ageist that needs to be pointed out. But here are the tools that you can start to use. One thing that I wanted to mention that I think is great when you say that you might have to retrain somebody in the communications organization that you work with is, well, the person that's not there anymore was trained and they went someplace else and they went there with the knowledge, right? So they're not going to just stop using that, right? They bring it to wherever else, other projects that they may be working on. And so that's kind of this way that this network builds and intersects and starts to really make a change. Because we know we speak in many different audiences, and as we bring this forward, we're sharing this message across those audiences. So so I'm sorry that you had to retrain somebody. But I love that someone was trained and they went someplace, they've gone either onto another job or another project that they'll remember what they learned here.
Yeah. I don't know that I retrained anyone. I trained them for the first time.
Mhm.
So, because again, this isn't something that's pervasive or taught, hasn't historically been taught, considering, this is a fairly recent initiative. And so maybe current high school seniors are getting the current APA, AMA, AP guidelines, but not the current group, so, but yeah, so
But
it does take,
we have our job.
yeah.
We have our job cut out for us. We do recognize that. Yeah.
Yeah. And also clarifying, because I was actually in a meeting yesterday and was talking about doing this podcast with you. And somebody was like, well, don't use the word elderly. And I was like, actually, using the word elderly is okay. Using the term the elderly is othering people, and that's not what we want to do. And so even within my circles of experts, to make that clear distinction, it's not the word elderly. And like you said, again, even the term seniors isn't bad. It's just how you use it, and it's within the context of the conversation. So there's still room for all of us to improve. And just like you said, it can be a hard shift. It's like you were doing the us them thing, like, oh, see there, I just did it, and I do it. I catch myself sometimes too. But I think that's good, because it means that we're paying attention and we are aware, and we're catching ourselves. Whereas before, like even making that decision yesterday not to buy, the birthday card that was like over the hill, or, birthday party supply groups are the same way. So I think we'll get there. And so I appreciate the work that you've done. And I appreciate you being here with me today. So any final thoughts before we close out?
I just wanted to say thank you so much. Congratulations on this fantastic podcast series. I think it's great, and it's what we need to be able to share with the public. And if people do have any questions for us, if you get any questions, please don't hesitate to forward them. And reframingaging.org is our website, and that's the best way to learn a little bit more about this project. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So I guess all those summers at Camp Reframing Aging have paid off. So, all right. Thank you so much. And we'll see everybody on the next episode. Thank you for tuning in to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor. And if you'd like to learn more, you can check out my other episodes on my YouTube channel by subscribing and ringing the bell to get immediate notifications when new content comes out. In addition, you can also find the audio version of the podcast on Amazon Music, Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Please feel free to leave an honest review, because more reviews mean more awareness of the podcast. If you have a comment or a question, you can visit my website, melissabphd.com. Go to the Contact Melissa tab, and you can leave me a voice message. You never know, it might just include your question or your comment in an upcoming episode.